All right, guys, today we are moving away from westward expansion. We're starting a new unit, which is the Civil War, which means we're going to be dealing with some rougher topics here. I think you're going to learn a lot out of this, but we are going to be covering things like slavery and things like that. So just be prepared for that as we talk about this, our first set of notes for this new unit. Something that I want you to consider, in your opinion, what does the word slavery mean? What is the difference between a slave and a servant? Remember, we've talked about indentured servants coming over in Jamestown, but there is a big difference between that and slavery. And how does a person know if they're a slave to someone else? Are there any conditions that would make servitude or slavery even remotely acceptable to you? Um, some people argue that we are slaves to the economic system that we're in right now. Is that an acceptable form of slavery compared to something like slavery back in the 1800s before the Civil War, where human beings were in slavery to other human beings directly? Is there a difference there, or is all forms of slavery just as despicable? Consider that. But in your notes today, at the very top, we're going to call this North, South, and Slavery. We've been looking at the differences between people moving west and how the land out west was different from back east where they came from. But something we're going to talk about today is the differences between the North and the South, which during the mid 1800s are becoming a bigger and bigger divide between the North and the South. They are completely different societies, and many people argued they were really becoming their own unique countries. We'll see what you think of that by the end of today. Here's what the map looks like at the end of where we left off with westward expansion. So Oregon is a territory. It will eventually become a state in 1859. California is a state. You can see the areas in the green up here is the northern areas, and down here is the south, and then we have these territories in the Midwest that have not been turned into states yet. So this is what America looks like right around the year 1850. Now, we do need to make a few comparisons here. The North is much more different from the South. In the North, they've got lots of railroads. They're focused on industry and machines. The primary mode of transportation in the North is by railroad. That's the fastest way of getting around. They have industry and factories, mostly powered by water, although eventually they will move to steam power, coal power, but they're powered by water at this point. They make things like clothing, different products, things like ammunition, metal stuff, anything that's made out of steel. That typically comes from the North during this time, and it is wage-based labor. In the North, they pay people to work in factories. Now, a lot of people automatically assume that, compared to slavery, the people in the North have it really nice. That's not necessarily true. In the North, even though you're being paid a wage, there is no minimum wage. You're not going to be paid a lot of money, and there is no minimum age for working in a factory either. They use a lot of child labor, and there are many instances where they use children to go inside of machines to be able to grease them, and the machines are accidentally turned on, and the kid is injured, loses an arm or a leg, or even killed, and there is no compensation for the family that child comes from. There's no workers' comp or anything like that. So conditions in the North can be pretty miserable. And most people in the North live in cities. They are in urban areas where populations gather together, places like New York, Philadelphia, places like that. In the South, the primary mode of transportation is by steamboat. They focus on agriculture, farms, especially these huge plantations where cotton and tobacco is grown. They produce cotton and tobacco as their two biggest products in the South. It is slave-based labor, so most of the workers who are working out in fields are not being paid for this. They are treated as slaves, and that's how the system works. And there are few cities in the South. There are some big cities, but most people live in a rural setting with small towns or plantations. Those are kind of the big differences between the North and the South. Now, looking at the North a little more specifically, in the North, there's lots of factories. And in the 1800s, you're going to find things like shoes, watches, especially pocket watches, are going to come about during this time. Guns, ammunition, cannons, things like that. Sewing machines are invented around this time. That comes out of the North, and other types of machinery. In the North, slavery had been outlawed in every state in the North by at least the year 1820. Now, slaves first arrived in America in the 1600s, in 1619 in Jamestown, only 7 years after English Europeans came over to America to settle to begin with. But by 1820, slavery had been outlawed in the North. It was not outlawed in the South, of course, until after the Civil War. The slave trade really begins actually over in Africa when tribes over in northern Africa sell each other into slavery. When Europeans come on the African continent by the 14 and 1500s, they start continuing this slave trade that originates in Africa and that spreads to North America. Of course, in the north, slavery slowly dissipates. In the south, it's going to take a huge war to finally outlaw slavery. But again, like I said earlier, conditions in the North, even though they've outlawed slaves, are not much better than living as a slave in the South. Now, it's kind of rough to make those two comparisons, but if you're working in a factory in the North, you're only a couple steps away from slavery. The conditions are awful. You have very few rights as a person working in a factory. You don't even necessarily have the right to quit, depending on which factory you work for, who you work for. So, all of these things make it basically what I'm trying to say is that we love to think when we look at the Civil War that the North is this righteous territory that's in the right, and they're completely justified for this war, but they're actually not quite the good guys they may seem in all the North versus South stories. So conditions can be just as bad in the North as they are in many places in the South. The average work day in the North is 11 and a half hours long. Compare that to nowadays when we work about 8 hours a day. You worked a lot more in the North in the mid 1800s. Of course, cities were exploding during this time. In fact, the U.S. greatly expanded between the years of 1840 and 1860. The largest group to come over here was the Irish during the 1840s because of a huge potato famine which destroyed their crops, and people ended up starving so much they ended up coming to America to escape the miserable conditions over in Ireland, which leads to the rise of the Irish in places like New York, Boston, and Chicago, where many groups of Irish reside to this day. So cities really did explode. But when they moved to those places, they faced prejudice. People looked down on the Irish, kind of like how people of different cultures are looked down upon for moving to different parts of America today. They had low wages and they usually got the worst jobs, the manual labor jobs, sweeping the streets, the sanitation jobs, taking out the garbage, things like that, or jobs that were seen as too rough for other people. Firefighters during the 1800s, the majority are Irish because it's seen as a job that nobody else wants. But it creates this tradition where the Irish are a huge part of the firefighter culture to this day. But it's all during this rise of cities during the mid 1800s. In the South, which is way different from the North, cotton is king. That is the main product that they are making in the South. Now, like I said, slavery started as early as 1619 in Jamestown. They started by growing tobacco, which we talked about earlier in the year with John Rolfe bringing it over. But eventually they find that the land in the South is really well suited, especially to growing cotton. And of course, you make clothing out of cotton. Cotton is grown on a plant where you literally have to take the cotton off, separate the seeds by hand. It is a strenuous and arduous, it is a miserable process of trying to process cotton. But because cotton is very profitable, farming became the most important thing in the South rather than making factories. So for 100 years, from the 1700s to the 1800s, they don't focus on building factories because they're making so much money off of cotton and selling that to make clothes that it really does well for the South's economy. Now, of course, the trouble with cotton is you have to separate the seeds from it, and it is a long process. The average slave could only clean about 1 pound of cotton per day by hand. So, yes, cotton plantation owners are going to make some money off of this, but not as much money as they were wanting to. And during the early 1800s, late 1700s, the slave trade kind of stagnated in the South. A lot of people thought it would go away on its own until one person came along and changed that. He wanted to invent a machine that would make it easier to pick cotton, not so that slavery would expand, but so that slavery would die. But instead, it had the opposite effect. The guy's name was Eli Whitney. He creates a machine called the cotton engine. It's basically a machine where you put cotton that has seeds in it on one side, crank it, and cotton without seeds comes on the out on the other end. His hope is this will do away with slavery. He's like, hey, if we have this machine, we don't need slaves to be able to do this anymore because hey, they were only doing 1 pound a day. You can use this machine instead. Well, it backfires because now a worker can produce 50 pounds of cotton a day instead of one, and the South, instead of getting rid of slaves, most of the owners go out and buy new slaves because now they can make more cotton and sell it and get even richer. So this has the opposite effect. More slaves are needed to make cotton because of the cotton engine, what was known as the cotton gin. So it's very likely if this had never been invented, slavery might have died out eventually, and the South would have gone the way of the North and eventually outlawed it because it wouldn't have been profitable. Unfortunately, the cotton engine makes slavery profitable, and it turns what was dying into something that begins to thrive all over again. Let's look at the numbers a little bit here. You can see how it exploded. In 1790, before the cotton engine is invented, there are 500,000 slaves in the United States, almost all of them concentrated in the South at this time. By 1860, after the cotton engine and after the North has outlawed slavery, there are 4 million slaves in the South. So you can see the number explodes by 8 times as much, mostly because of that invention. In 1850, 50% of the farms and plantations in the South are growing cotton. 25% of all white people in the entire South own slaves. So this is kind of a misconception. Most people think people in the South owned, the majority of them owned slaves. It's not true. The minority owned slaves. Only 1 out of 4 people had a slave. 3 out of 4 did not. So for people who love to claim that the South, the majority owned slaves, that's not the case. It's not actually true. 50% of the people who did own slaves had less than 5. So there's not a huge number of huge plantations where there's hundreds of slaves, that sort of thing. Only 4% of southern farms had 20 or more slaves on them. Only 4%. Now, that's still more than there should have been, but the point is that when people look at the South and go, oh man, yeah, everybody was a slave owner and they had these huge plantations and owned all these slaves, that's not actually the case. The numbers are a little different. Of course, if you were a slave, life was pretty miserable. You had 3 times a higher chance of dying than anybody else, mostly because of the long work hours that you put in. Your life expectancy, if you were a white person in the South at the time, you were expected to live into your late 40s. If you were African American, you would be expected to live to your late 20s. That's a big difference because of what toll slavery had on the life of someone. At any given time, an African American, about 25% of them were sick with some sort of disease because of how hard life was under slavery. So imagine living in a culture where 25% of everyone is sick at any given time. Those are huge numbers. Of course, there are different types of slaves, and I want you to understand some of the differences. There are house slaves. There are slaves who are housekeepers, maids, maybe even teachers to children in the family of the plantation they're working on. These are not the majority of slaves. This is the easier job by far because the other type of slave is the field slave, slaves who work in the field picking cotton or processing tobacco. 75% of the slaves that existed in the South were field slaves, which was the harder job by far. Only 25% were house slaves. And they worked, these field slaves, on average 18 hours a day. 18 hours. That meant you only had 6 remaining hours as a slave to be able to make your own meals and get some sleep and do anything else in your life. You spent the majority of your life working out in the fields. 3/4 of your life was working as a slave for someone else. They had an overseer, a person who made sure that they were doing what they were supposed to be doing, usually had a whip on them to be able to discourage anyone from um, rebelling against them. So there was an overseer, and while they were working, African Americans came up with a culture of singing while they were working, not only to keep pace as they were working, but also to develop their own sense of identity. This is actually where jazz music and R&B and different types of music nowadays come from, is from the old slave hymns and songs that they came up with as they worked in the field, toiling through their condition. The last thing I want to talk about today is slave life. Not only did you work long hours, but you didn't get paid for it. There was no compensation. The only thing your owner had to provide for you was a roof over your head and enough food to barely survive. Families were often separated, so husbands and wives, when you got married, they added a part to their vows where instead of just saying till death do us part, they said till death or distance do you part, because often a husband and wife would be separated, their kids would be separated from them. A husband could be sold to work on another plantation, and he would never see his wife and kids ever again. There were some states that had laws that said that you couldn't separate children as long as they were 5 years or younger away from their families. But in those states, if they were older than 5, you could separate them. There's a lot of slave auctions where 7 and 8-year-olds were sold. Um, and worse still, there were other states where there were no minimum ages to being sold. You could be a couple years old and be sold and separated from your family. Slaves had no rights. They were absolutely miserable conditions. And there was little hope of freedom unless you tried to escape. And if you tried to escape as a slave, you faced punishment if you were caught, death if you tried it enough times. And we're going to look at some of the people who tried later on this week to help slaves escape, people who were part of an organization called the Underground Railroad, people who were against slavery. They were known as abolitionists. We're going to look at the efforts made to try and put an end to slavery. Those are the differences between the North and the South and what life was like as a slave. We'll talk about some more of this stuff some more, but I wanted to give you just kind of a brief outline on that. And I hope you learned something useful through that today. Have a good one, guys.